they really need replenishments of this at a very fast rate. Otherwise, they cannot continue to defend themselves from these Russian attacks. So, unfortunately, they don't have very much time until this begins to impact them very seriously.
How critical do you think is the situation regarding military supplies to Ukraine? We've seen those warnings that indeed Ukrainian forces could be running low on the vital missiles that they need.
Well, I think it is a very critical situation. I mean, the Ukrainians have recently had a few successes destroying a Russian amphibious warship, and they've, destroyed about 20% of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. On the other hand, there have been these relentless Russian bombardments of Ukrainian cities, particularly in the last week. They are running low on supplies. And as you mentioned, the US Congress is deadlocked on this. Hopefully in January, when they come back from the Christmas break, they will reach some compromise. It involves giving more money for border security in the United States at the southern border, but also providing more assistance for Ukraine. But if Ukraine doesn't get that, if they don't get those weapons, they will be in a very difficult situation in the coming months.
And I'll come back to the situation in the US in just a moment. But I mean, Ukraine has seen these attacks, bombardment right across numerous of its cities simultaneously by Russian forces. And although the Ukrainians hit back with attacks on some of those Russian targets close to Ukraine's border, that does appear to be a very strong signal from President Putin of his intent for the coming year.
Oh, it certainly does. I mean, there's going to be no let up in this. This war is going to go on for a long time. Putin has said, and he said it again, I think today, we're ready to negotiate, but on our terms. But failing that, and I think that's not going to happen, this war will be going on in 2024. The Russians are getting more ammunition now from the North Koreans. They're getting drones from the Iranians, and they have more men that they can mobilize, which they probably will do after the re-election of Putin in March. But I see no let up in this, and I think Putin is waiting in 2024 for transatlantic unity and support for Ukraine to falter. He's waiting for the US election, a presidential election in November, and for different elections in Europe that also could bring to power more people who are skeptical about supporting Ukraine.
Yeah, President Vladimir Putin has just today pledged to intensify attacks against Ukraine. Until now, what we've seen is that those air defences, particularly in the capital Kyiv, have, to a large degree at least, protected the civilian population. How long do you think Ukraine has before the supplies of those crucial missiles really do start to dwindle to a critical level?
Well, I think it's just a matter of months, because if they don't, again, if the U.S. Congress can't agree to supply more weapons to Ukraine, I mean, there are European countries that are supplying, and Britain is certainly supplying Ukraine with advanced weapons too, but they really need replenishments of this at a very fast rate. Otherwise, they cannot continue to defend themselves from these Russian attacks. So, unfortunately, they don't have very much time until this begins to impact them very seriously.
President Biden has been appealing to senators to give the go-ahead for more military supplies. How do you read the situation there? Obviously, we have a very divided House. We've got those relatively small groups of Republican senators who are essentially blocking the next tranche of military and other equipment to Ukraine. Do you get the sense that this is just going to continue?
Well, unfortunately, it could continue for some time. Again, this is an election year, 2024. Everything is highly polarized and partisan. It's only a small group of Republicans that's blocking this assistance to Ukraine, but they have quite a lot of clout in the Congress, again, because the majorities are so thin. So, the Biden administration will try to get a compromise, and the majority of Republican senators, for instance, support continued assistance for Ukraine. So they will try and get a compromise on this, but it does hinge on border security. And the Democratic Party itself is supportive of Ukraine, but it's divided on what one should do about border security. So the next few weeks, I think, will be crucial in getting this sorted out.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned border security. That's the demand, isn't it, from the Republican senators for more measures to protect the United States southern border against migrants coming across there. Let me ask you about that forthcoming election, because, of course, Donald Trump has said that he'll sort out the war in Ukraine on day one. It's not quite clear exactly what he has in mind. But do you think there is this sense that perhaps the Republican senators and indeed President Putin himself are essentially holding out in the hope that Donald Trump does win power in November, and that will mean a major shift in US policy towards the war?
Well, I think certainly President Putin is holding out for that. And if you watch Russian television, they're very gleeful that the Congress is so divided about all of this, and they're just waiting for President Trump to come back into power. So I think, as you said, he said he would sort this out in 24 hours. There's absolutely no way clearly that he could do that. But what he could do is cut off all assistance for Ukraine, providing that the Congress goes along with that. He can't do that unilaterally. But still, I think the sense is if he comes in, the majority of Republicans will say we need to spend this money on our own domestic problems. And, this war is far away. And then there's a significant minority, at least in the Republican Party, supporters of Trump that, favor Russia and are very critical of Ukraine.
We've also, of course, got the war continuing in Gaza. And there is this sense, isn't there, that a lot of the international focus that was on Ukraine switched to the Middle East. The United States has also, of course, been providing Israel with additional military supplies and support. How significant a factor do you think that is?
Well, I think certainly the world's attention has turned away from the Russia-Ukraine war and obviously very focused on what's happening in Gaza. And I think that, the congressional bill, which would support Ukraine, also has in it more funding for Israel. And so that will be part of the bargaining, when the Congress comes back to see whether that can be arranged. But it's also, I think, diverted the Biden administration's attention away from the Russia-Ukraine war. And obviously, Russia has benefited tremendously from this, because there's no attention being paid to it. And also, Russia has changed its policy in the Middle East. It's really distanced itself from Israel, with whom it had quite a close relationship, particularly Putin and Netanyahu. And it's come out squarely in support of the Palestinians. It hasn't criticized Hamas, and it's gained even more support from countries in the global south because of that.
Let me just ask you about those latest developments in the Red Sea, because we've had warnings from the British Defence Secretary of possible strikes on Houthi rebels. We've already seen American strikes on some of those rebels in the Red Sea. Is there a sense in which the United States is at risk of being inadvertently drawn into a wider conflict there?
Well, there certainly is. And the previous person you had on was, correctly saying that Iran is very much behind this. And there is, this war could escalate. It could spread. There's also the question of Hezbollah and whether that would draw the United States more into some conflict there. So I think we're on very uncertain ground here in terms of how limited this war in the Middle East is. And certainly we've had a lot of American casualties from these Houthi strikes, and this could go on for some time.
And how much of a factor is all of this going to be in the presidential election? Because, of course, President Biden had vowed to get the United States out of these forever wars. He carried on with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and we all know about the consequences there. But it does appear as though there is a risk of the developments in the Red Sea running completely counter to the narrative that he's set out.
Well, the most important factor in any presidential election, in any election anywhere really, is economics. So the focus and Biden's low popularity has to do with inflation, with the cost of living and things like that. That's what people will be very focused on. But in terms of foreign policy, yes, people don't want the United States to get drawn into, quote unquote, forever wars. And and that's one of the criticisms of Ukraine, even though there are, of course, no US troops there. So I think that it will be necessary for him to show that his foreign policy has been successful. And it looked fairly successful for much of last year. But with the ongoing war with Ukraine and the current developments in the Middle East, it may be more difficult for him and his administration to make that case.